R4 zone. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It is high noon, and thank you for joining us for the higher density residential zone code update webinar. This is the second in a series of zoning code update webinars that the town is doing. Thank you all so much for joining us. Looks like we've still got a few attendees rolling in, so we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to get through today. And we'll jump straight into who's presenting in our agenda. I'm Miles Graham, and I've had the good fortune of facilitating a number of these Compass navigation type meetings, and I'm joined by town staff, starting with Malyama.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mel Yema, Community Development Director, and I'll turn it over to Jesse.
I'm Jessie Early. I'm Senior Planner and the current Planning Manager here at Town Hall.
My name is Caitlin Archambault. I will be behind the scenes here. My camera's not working, but excited to be here with you all.
Dara McDonald, Town Manager. I will be eating my lunch while I listen, and you don't need to watch me do that.
Thanks, Dara, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to jump straight into the agenda because the webinar we did yesterday was our first, and we've got a lot to cover. So our lesson learned from that is to try to move pretty quickly here at the front end so we can maximize the discussion and the Q&A here in the latter half of the meeting. So we're going to start with some big picture updates on why we are updating the code and how we are going about updating our zoning code. And then we're going to dive into some of the details, starting with what the heck is zoning anyway, what changes are being considered in this particular zone. And then, as I said, we're going to try to prioritize as much time for Q&A and discussion as we go. You'll be able to use, in addition to the Mentimeter that Mel mentioned earlier, and we're going to show in a second, there's also a Q&A feature on Zoom that's in your bottom control panel, and that allows you to enter in questions that you may have for the team before we get to the Q&A. Once we get to Q&A, we'll go through those questions, but at Q&A, you'll be able to raise your hand and unmute and ask your questions verbally if you prefer. There will be a follow-up survey that we send out after this webinar, so you can go a little bit deeper into that. And certainly, we're going to be sharing out this recording and information with all of you after the webinar, and you can reach out to town staff at planning@crested-butte-co.gov anytime. So on the next slide, you're going to see our interactive Mentimeter information. You can scan this QR code in your phone, or you can go into menti.com and enter the code you see here on screen, which will also be at the top of every slide as we go. And you can use that tool, and it looks like a number of you have already gotten on to answer some of our fun interactive questions that we've got here today. And our first Menti exercise is a fun little icebreaker, and we would love to know what you love most about your neighborhood. In this instance, it's the R4 zone district, but this is intended to bring forward the things you love most about your zone as we work into the zoning code update process. This exercise is an opportunity for the town to really align its zoning code with the community values and what you value most about your neighborhood and the people who live there. We'll give you all just a second more. The open-ended ones are the trickiest because you've got to type in. We'll have some mentees later that are more multiple choice polls that will be a little easier to answer, but we want to start on a positive note. And we've got the location and the people, um, the quiet and the community. Good access to transportation. And for those of you who have been involved in the Crested Butte Community Compass process, you know that access to transportation in town and the what we call the mode share of people who bike and walk in Crested Butte is pretty amazing and the envy of a lot of communities everywhere. Okay. Well, let's keep moving. As I said, we've got a lot to cover, so we'll definitely be coming back to the things we love and the things we would improve as we enter into the start of this process. And Mel's gonna talk about why we're updating the code and how we're going about it.
Thanks, Miles. So, diving right into the big picture, We love Crested Butte and its small town charm and our sense of community, but we're facing a lot of challenges as a community. A lot of change is happening to us. And for a long time, we've been reacting incrementally to each challenge. We know a lot of growth is happening, especially around us, putting pressure on the town. The town itself is landlocked and limited in development potential. And what we've seen in recent decades and especially recent years as our market is really out of balance. We're seeing free market development really cater to amenities, tourism, luxury developments. Think of the boutique hotel or the $100 hamburger steak restaurant, where those community needs of community serving housing, community serving affordable spaces, and those things that make our community function are really subsidized by the public sector. So you see the town of Crested Butte playing a big role over 3 decades now in developing affordable housing, Mount Crested Butte, the county as well. And that's really become quite unsustainable. And through all of this, we've seen community livability and affordability eroding in many senses. So now is really the time to be more proactive and identify and work towards the future our community wants. How can we guide growth to meet our community needs? How can we be strategic about the remaining development potential in Crested Butte? And how can we try to bring some balance back into the market through a mix of regulations and incentives? And in general, how can we just make our zoning code clearer, easier to use, and better aligned with our community values? But going about this is really hard and takes a lot of time, work, persistence, and engagement and participation from the community. So we're not starting the zoning code overnight and just starting today. This has really been a work in process since the Community Compass starting back in 2021. And hopefully you participated in it or you heard of it or you've read it. And if not, there's still lots of opportunities to engage. So what we did first, instead of saying, hey, we need to update our zoning code to try to get more affordable housing, we said, hey, let's really start at this 20,000 foot level and understand what are our shared values and goals as a community. From there, let's hone in and really identify, okay, what's our strategy? What's our vision and how we go about land use in our community plan, how we go about transportation mobility in that plan, and historic preservation, climate action, and all these things that are so important to us. And now we're at the stage of, okay, let's realize that vision through our regulations and programs with this zoning code update. So just to do a quick recap on the compass, it identified our 4 community values as being authentic, connected, accountable, and bold. And it identified 7 goals to really work towards over the next 5 years that are really guiding the town's priorities, their budget investments, their decisions at this moment. But a lot of these goals are interconnected and conflicting. So, what those subsequent plans after the compass really set out to do is, okay, how can we try to work towards these goals in a way that's aligned with our values? So, the community plan really set to look at that tension and interplay between how do we accommodate growth in a way that maintains our rural feel, but also enable people who live and work here to thrive. There's definitely a tension there, but also some opportunities. So, the community plan really set out to look at what is our vision to try to do that. So it looked at a goal of how do we improve the livability, functionality, and sense of community in Crested Butte by leveraging our development regulations to thoughtfully guide free market investment in community serving housing and spaces for businesses and nonprofits. So the community plan was not a new housing plan of the town saying we're going to build these housing developments over the next 5 years. It was all about looking at the private sector and how do we leverage our regulations to have the free market be a better partner in meeting our community's needs. And now we're in the phase of implementing it here. So that plan really set out with 2 primary objectives: expand, diversify, and distribute community serving housing, which we've done a pretty good job of so far over the last several decades. A quarter of the town's housing stock is deed restricted in some form to either be a long-term rental, to you have to live here full time, to you have to work here, or certain income limits and things like that. So that's really great, but we know it's still a challenge. But on the other end, a new journey that we're starting right now is looking at the commercial side of things. Housing is one piece of our cost of living pie. Transportation's another. So I was really glad to see that come up earlier too. but the commercial side and those needs that make our community function, having access to childcare, having access to trades, having a place to get an affordable bite to eat. Those are all sorts of things that make up our community as well and our quality of life. So the plan also looked at how can we facilitate, create, and preserve more community serving spaces. And what the plan did was looked at different areas of town and identified an overall future land use vision and recommended tools of how to go about trying to meet these objectives within our development regulations. So as you can see, there's not one all size fits all, and each of these zoning webinars are really going to hone in on some of those different tools. So looking at Bellevue and the tools that are going to be really different than the tools we're looking at here in the multifamily zone, which we'll get more into the details in just a minute. So the community plan identified the vision and recommended the tools, but now we need to make it happen. So in the zoning code update that we're doing right now is we want to actually enable that vision. How can we update our regulations to make sure that vision is actually possible? And at the same time, we're developing a new housing strategy and community spaces strategy to implement the vision to go hand in hand with the code. We can set up regulations here, but then are there other project incentives, financial incentives, programs that really can complement those regulations to really work together towards meeting our goals? At the same time, I want to be clear that we're talking about zoning today, and we'll talk about exactly what that is. But design standards are a really important part of our development and review processes too. And we're also going to be updating those starting next month, and we'll go over how to participate in that. But that came from our historic preservation plan, which really looked at to complement the community plan. Hey, how do we influence the design or guide the design of our buildings in our community to make sure they really reflect the evolution of Crested Buttes community over time while still preserving our history. So we'll get into what that is going to look like as well. So to update the code itself, we have a 3-step process. We spent the bulk of the summer since the community plan was adopted in July doing a lot of internal review and preparation. If anything, our code just needs a lot of cleanup, improving definitions, modernizing things to make it much more easier to understand and consistent. And then we've held a lot of work sessions with Beaux-Arts, our Board of Zoning and Architectural Review, who really reviews currently all development coming into Crested Butte to understand what's going well, what's not going well, and how could the code and our development review processes be improved. Now we're at the phase of doing community engagement. So we spent some time then with Beaux-Arts and the town council to identify some guiding strategies to guide this code update that really are the culmination of all of those different plans, the community plan, the preservation plan, the transportation plan, all combined. And now we're doing outreach with you all through these code webinars and a survey, as well as some technical and market analysis of the proposed incentives that we'll go over today. And then in the winter and spring, we'll continue drafting, we'll continue refining, and we'll continue getting your feedback to make sure that we have a code that really reflects the community's values and really reflects your feedback. So if you participate in the Compass, you might know we rewrote that 7 times. Same with the community plan, I think was maybe 3 times. But there will be several drafts. Today's just the first. So just know it's the first draft of considerations, and we're excited for your feedback to improve it. So we want to hear from you quickly. What are your preferred ways to engage in this update? Just a quick multiple choice question. We want to make sure we really hone in on a process that really is accessible and in ways that you can actually engage in. So do you prefer webinars, surveys, council or Beaux-Arts meetings, open houses? Tell us to get more creative. We want to hear from you.
Well, it looks like some of our early returns are affirming the direction that we're on with webinars and surveys, some interest in open houses, and as Mel said, this is early on in the zoning code update process, so this information will help us tailor how we engage with the community going forward.
Awesome, thank you. Great feedback here. All right. So, what is guiding this process? As I said, Council and Bozar spent some time coming to alignment on those guiding strategies. And here's our first draft of what we ended up with. And I'm excited about these because they're really that culmination of the community plan. If you took all of our different plans in the compass and gave an executive summary, I feel like this is what that is for the zoning code. So, number one, we want to simplify the code. How do we make our code and our development review processes easier to understand and more accessible to engage in and move through? Retain our small town feel. How do we retain that special small town lifestyle that we come here for when it comes to the scale and the feel of our buildings and our neighborhoods? But also, that lifestyle is the people and knowing your neighbors. So I'm really glad to see that come up in what you love most about your zone. Strengthen historic preservation. So, how do we look at how we might shift how we've been preserving the full town as a mining era period of significance? And as we move to different tools to reflect different periods of our town history, how can we strengthen those tools that we have to make sure that's really guarded? Fourth, integrate land use with transportation and climate action. How can we modernize and update our land uses to really enable more people to live closer to where they work and where they access services and where they access businesses and things like that, as that's so important with our other goals as a community. And then lastly, link zoning to community benefits. So how do we really look at and evaluate and implement those incentives identified in the community plan to make sure our code produces those community needs rather than just having that bifurcated market? So this was just presenting you for the first time with these draft strategies, but we want to hear your initial reaction. Which of these strategies are most important to you? And there is an option to say, I need to think about this more, and that's totally okay. We also, in that survey, will be asking you this again, and you can think more on it too. So definitely don't feel too worried about having the exact correct answer because those priorities can change. Awesome. Seeing a great mix across the board, which I think is important that to say all of these strategies are really important. All right, so I've done quite a bit of talking. Let's dive into the details now. But first, we'll do a little break to talk about what is zoning anyways.
And for this one, we want to just take the temperature of our attendees here today and just see how familiar you feel with our current zoning and what it is. Everywhere from on one end of the spectrum, what is zoning, to on the other end, I'm an expert. I follow all the rules and regs at the town level and maybe even nationally. And it looks like so far we have a pretty good split. So we've got two looking at some sort of regulations. This is a great place. You're in the right spot to learn more. We've got two, it's whatever Bozar requires. One weighing in on it, I know the rules of my own zone, and two, very well versed in the town's zoning map. This is also where I want to give a plug for that Q&A feature in your command bar. As we start to go through some of these details, it's going to be a lot of information. So if there are questions you have, feel free to drop them in the Q&A function, and we'll get to them during the discussion portion of the agenda.
Okay. Well, it looks like some of you are pretty familiar with zoning, but I'm going to do a quick overview about the what zoning is for those not so familiar. So zoning is basically the way a city or a town divides land into different areas called zones to control how property can be used and developed. Each zone has its own rules about the things on the screen here. So the use of the land, the density of how the buildings fit. So for instance, floor area ratio, which we'll talk about more later, how the building fits on the lot. So setbacks, measurements, parking, and then other regulations such as ROA, demolition, floodplain. And the main goal of zoning overall is to make sure the land is used in a way that's safe, organized, and supports the community's overall plan for growth. Next slide, please. And so this slide kind of shows how zoning fits into the overall process because there's multiple factors that regulate development. And it's to make sure that projects are safe and appropriate and consistent with our goals as a community. And for our community, the factors that apply to development are the zoning regulations that you see on the left, design standards that you see on the right, and then things like building codes and subdivision regulations. Together, these layers of regulations shape how the development happens. And so it balances the private property rights with public safety, and then the community vision, like I said. These development review processes are evaluated as a part of each. And so there's, decision authorities and timelines associated with each of those. Next slide. So this slide's very similar to the last one, but part of what we're tasked with this process overall is just to make sure that the processes are easy to understand and more efficient. So for example, staff could review certain projects administratively to help to streamline the review process, where other projects would go to Beaux Arts for a more thorough review if they, for say, don't check all the boxes and meet the goals of the community, for instance.
And as we get into the details here, we do want to give some context. So any changes being considered to the zoning code would influence development going forward. So if a change was made, say adjusting setbacks or adjusting parking, it wouldn't be the town coming in and saying, you now have to take out all of your parking and add to your building to this setback. It would influence any new development or redevelopment going forward. And with that, Crested Butte has some pretty unique context. We're pretty built out and we have pretty strong demolition regulations that we'll go over today. So while redevelopment is possible, we're not looking at possibilities of like huge scrapes and rebuilding, and this zoning code really looking at changing the feel of our town overnight. Any potential changes would be pretty slow and incremental, but could have an influence in the long term. So diving into the R4 zone. So the general intent of this is areas for more intensive residential development while fitting into the neighborhood context. The map on the left is the first draft of the proposed zoning map, and there is a little tweak to the R4 zone that I want to go over. So the first update focus area is consolidating most of the current tourist zone and the R4 zone, recognizing a lot of the tourist zone today is actually high density residential development. So this area here, which was previously in the tourist zone, we're proposing to become R4 instead of T. And then same with here, which is Anthracite Place, the Crystal Creek condos, the Sylvanite condos, all of those residential areas. But then those parts of the tourist zone that are more commercial, like the Christiana Guest House, the hostel, we're proposing that those would become the B2 zone, which is the corridor along 6th Street. And we do have a webinar for that coming up in 2 weeks. The other changes you'll see on this map is we're proposing a different approach to historic preservation. Previously, the full town boundary was designated as our local historic district. So that means any development in the town has to be built to design standards that reflect the mining era of our period's history. The historic preservation plan called for, hey, let's switch that up. We still really want to staunchly preserve that mining history, but there's other periods of our history and the evolution of the community that we want to look at preserving too. So what that calls for is the idea of these overlay zones, where this red boundary here is a buffer around the National Historic District. So homes and businesses and buildings that fall in there would say, okay, you are going to reference this chapter of the design guidelines or the design standards, that regulate the look and feel for that mining era period of significance. And then it calls for evaluating and adopting a new period of significance called the early recreation era, which is the period of time from after the mine closed to the mid 80s, where the town transitioned from a mining town to a ski and recreation focused town. So, what we're doing right now is a survey of all of those buildings for architectural significance and integrity. Thank you to a grant from the State Historic Fund for that, of all those buildings that are in that period, which will then help us determine what is that designation and what does that district look like. So any of the parcels shaded here, that means those are being surveyed to be under consideration, but we know based on the architecture and all that, it would likely shrink down from everything that's on there today, but it will be more of a salt and pepper district. So anything that does end up falling in that overlay zone would then say, okay, you're going to reference this next chapter of the design standards that have different standards around that era of our history. And then outside of those, the last chapter of the design standards would just have standards around mass, scale, and form, but offer a lot more flexibility for different architectural styles and forms. So instead of having everything built to look like it was from the mining era, it can showcase kind of our evolution over time as a community. So some other things we're going to talk about getting into today, the details of, aside from that consolidation, is right sizing parking requirements, removing single family as an allowed use in this multifamily zone, and evaluating a potential height incentive for more deed restricted housing. But before we dive into the details, let's hear from you. What challenges are you experiencing in your neighborhood or in your zone?
And this is another one where hopefully your keyboards are warmed up by now, and it's an open-ended one that you can drop in here. And for those of you who have attended many of the Community Compass meetings, this is also a similar question to one we ask a lot on what do you want to see more of in your neighborhood? Maybe what do you want to see less of? So that's all fair game here too. And in the interest of time, if we move away from this one while you're still thinking, I'm going to give one more plug out to our Q&A function in the command bar. Yesterday's webinar, that feature was getting blown up. So I don't see anything in there today. So just want to make sure that we're calling attention to that one before we get to Q&A. But we've got some great responses coming in. Challenges, certainly affordability, development incentives, snow removal, very similar to some of the themes we heard yesterday, wouldn't you say, Mel?
Absolutely. Yeah, we always forget this time of year the challenges of snow removal. And then a few months from now, we're like, oh, right. Yes, that is a big challenge. So, snow removal, parking were themes from yesterday too, as well as affordability.
We've got one more coming in for parking here. So some themes around affordability, parking, snow management, increase in traffic, and the potential conflicts associated with that intensity.
So, yeah, this is super helpful to get an insight into the challenges you're experiencing. Right. Should we keep moving?
Let's do it.
All right, so we're going to go through several key categories of zoning provisions, and we're going to kind of go quickly through these to talk about them, also we can leave plenty of time for Q&A, and then we'll show you how you can access these so you can sit with them and keep thinking on them.
Okay, so I'm going to hop into land uses, and many of the zone districts have a long list of uses which are either permitted or conditional uses. Permitted means that they can be done by right without an approval process, and then conditional means that some level of review is required. For our town, that means Bozar right now. One of the movements, as Mel mentioned, is to change the terminology from like single family residence duplex, triplex, multifamily to dwelling units. And so one of the changes you'll see is kind of reflected. The current uses are listed on the left. And then what we're proposing for the changed uses is on the right. And I'm going to just hop into those really quick just to make sure you see some of the key details. So as I mentioned, we're going to keep dwelling units, accessory buildings, accessory dwellings, home occupations, small child care facilities, congregate housing. These would all be permitted uses rather than conditional uses, as many of them are right now. Actually, the T zone, which some of your buildings may be in the T zone, everything is a conditional use right now. Hotels, motels, lodges is both a permitted use and a conditional use, so it's a little confusing in that zone. But so one of the things that would convert to a conditional use would be bed and breakfasts and larger childcare facilities, if those were ever proposed in those areas. One thing that would be cleaned up would be the assembly use, which is right now called churches within our zone district uses. So it would be more secular or religious assembly use. And then the things that would be removed would, as Mel said, would be single family, and then a school use, parking areas, hotels, motels, lodges, public playgrounds, and rec areas, and then the dormitory use, because we have that congregate housing use instead.
So on to the next topic of parking. As far as zoning goes, parking requirements is all about how much parking do we require to be built on the property itself as part of the development. And today with multifamily housing, we require 1.5 spaces per unit, and hotel lodges and motels, 1 space per rental bedroom in the tourist zone. What we're proposing is to lower the parking requirements to leverage our on-street parking and to essentially not have the town dictate you must have this many parking spaces, but have a minimum saying you need to meet this, but then it's up to you. It's up to the market of the amount of parking spaces you want to provide, and you need to provide for your development to be marketable or for your home to maintain your quality of life and lifestyle. Because we see a lot of times, a lot of towns and cities will say you have to have this many. Some people have more than that, some people have less than that. We really just want to right size and propose lowering the minimum to leverage the on-street parking that is available. So what's shown in yellow here is private parking that would be required by the zone, but then we do have public parking in the rights of ways. And I know this zone is challenging because there's so much head-end parking on the street that there's not a lot of on-street parking available, especially in the winter. And I know sometimes it can become nebulous where you park in this right of way and block a driveway. And we know there's challenges there, but because of the built out nature and recognizing this would influence development going forward, can we think about creating more space for people and housing and leveraging that on street, and potentially looking to how do we partner that with management, say a permit program or something, to really look at better managing it as well. So I think a really good example is the Meadows complex. All of their parking is, or sorry, half of their parking is in the right of way, I believe, where I think they have 1 space per unit currently, which was what we're talking about for the proposed new minimum. And it's working fine, but there are challenges in the winter with a lot of folks parking there to access the bus to go skiing. So the town implemented a permit program to work towards alleviating that. And it's still just going into its 2nd year, so ways for that to improve. But that's an example of how on-street management could match with off-street parking requirements.
Okay, so on to lot measurements. So these are things like lot area, lot width, and you can see the existing requirements. They're very similar for the R4 and the T zones right now. We're proposing to remove the minimum lot size. So we would only have a maximum lot size of 9,375, which is pretty much the same as it is right now. So not too much of a change there. And also removal of the minimum lot width. So removal of that 50-foot requirement. Next slide, please. And one thing I forgot to say on that slide is just that we're removing those minimums with the understanding that things like setbacks, parking, and FAR kind of help to control the size of the building and the lot and what's needed on the lot. So that's kind of the why behind what is proposed. And then as far as setbacks go, the front yard setback would change from 20 feet to a 10-foot setback with the potential allowance for porches within the setback. We may look at a maximum encroachment. So say a 5 foot would be allowed and any more than that would have to be within the setback or something like that. So that's still kind of a work in progress or thoughts. Side yard setbacks would stay the same. So 7.5 feet to 11.5 feet for sloped roof buildings. We're looking at a 0-foot setback we do allow for flat roof buildings within the zone for multi dwelling unit buildings. And so that's just more consistent with flat roof buildings throughout town, mostly seen in the commercial zones. And then also there'd be an allowance for mechanical equipment to encroach into the setback, that 7.5 feet to 11.5 feet. We would still need to make sure that that meets building code requirements, but we've been seeing that sometimes it's hard to fit some of that equipment on the site right now. And then the proposal would be to change the rear yard setback to be 5 feet for all buildings instead of the 10 foot for primary, 5 feet for accessory. And then if a rear yard functions as a side yard, it would need to meet the side yard setbacks. These are very kind of quirky, rare occurrences, but we feel like it's important to put that within the code for when those situations do come up, because we don't want to have shedding situations in an alley or onto another property.
All right, so every chapter of each zone right now in the code has a catch-all section of additional provisions. And essentially right now in the code, we have different requirements for each R4 and T around roof pitch and some stream margin review for floodplain requirements and a lot of random different things. And essentially all we're proposing here is to really clean up where things best live, to be extra clear and concise and simple. So things like roof forms and design provisions would be evaluated, but then updated and referenced in the design standards versus the zoning code itself. Same with stream margin review. We would look to kind of like the historic districts overlays. We'd be looking at some overlays for that for floodplain review. If you're in the floodplain and required to go to that section for those regulations, it wouldn't be embedded within the zone. And then we do have requirements around open space. And our initial thought in that simplification too is, instead of prescribing open space requirements, recognizing that all of the other site requirements from setbacks, parking, maximum building size all result in open space on the site. So how can we just try to simplify instead of prescribing sort of two different things where it will result in open space anyways? So that's the thought there.
Okay, so floor area ratio. Floor area ratio is the way we measure how much building can be constructed on a piece of land. And so it's basically the ratio of the building's mass or volume to the lot size. Our calculation is complicated. Some of you on the call are very familiar with our calculation. The R4 zone district, the way that it is now, is a fairly complicated FAR structure, as you can see on the left-hand column. So we're looking to clean up the requirements. There are ranges currently which aren't really used. Most people just aim for the maximum in these zone districts right now. So the proposed changes, the duplex would stay the same at 0.5, so 50% of the lot size. Triplexes and multi-unit buildings would be 0.6. And as you can see on the left, there's a range from 0.6 to 1.0. So what we'd be looking to do would be looking for that additional portion within the range to be used to somehow incentivize affordable housing or deed restricted units, instead of just having a range that doesn't really function right now, have that range actually have a purpose. And Mel will talk about that more under the incentives section itself. But And then we would also be removing the requirement for the minimum unit size. Right now we have a 400 square foot unit size for residential units. And instead we would just defer to the International Building Code, which kind of governs the size of residential units on its own. Next slide, please. So next we have building measurements. The R4 zone districts has a 30-foot height requirement and the T zone has a 35-foot height requirement. We would keep the 30-foot height requirement with the potential for an incentive to increase to 35 feet in exchange for, again, deed restricted units or affordable housing, a percentage to be determined. We need to evaluate this to determine what threshold would need to be met in order to obtain this incentive, but just it's an idea that has come up in discussion.
So on to the incentives. Currently, there really aren't any incentives built into the current code, except that kind of vague, you could go up to 1 FAR if with Beaux-Arts discretion and if it meets this. So we really want to look at, can we play with those things that are currently in there, but actually have some really specific requirements to get out of that. So for multifamily, would we consider allowing the FAR bonus from 0.6 to 1 and potentially a height bonus from 30 to 35 for those larger, more apartment style multifamily buildings in exchange for an inclusion of a certain percent of deed restricted community housing units? And that market analysis that we're doing right now is really going to put kind of numbers to different development scenarios to really help us determine what sort of percentage would actually be market feasible with our construction costs and all of that. So that percentage actual number is still to be determined. But a good example of this is Mineral Point. Being in the R4 zone currently, it was limited to 30 feet, which did limit it to 2 stories. So would we have considered a 5-foot bonus to have 3 stories and potentially more housing units there, to have more affordable housing units for our community?
So I'm going to talk briefly about demolition. So our demolition ordinance would be kept in the zoning code as it is now, but we would help to strengthen it. This ordinance right now basically requires that if a building's approved for demolition or relocation and is less and exists at less than the maximum FAR for that zone, to reach the maximum FAR with the redevelopment plan, an accessory dwelling unit must be part of the redevelopment plan. So that would stay as part of the code as we're proposing. There would also be a section pertaining to buildings from the new period of significance, as Mel mentioned. So that represents early recreation from 1961 to 1984. And then also we're looking to create incentives, the potential for incentives for stabilization and maintenance for buildings within each of the periods of significance. So the mining period and also the new period of significance. Next slide. And then finally, as Mel said, we're kicking off the design standards update process on November 18th, which is Beaux-Arts meeting. So we're really excited to kick that off. We've partnered with MIG Inc. to a consultant to help us do this work. It's a really big process. But again, we'll be creating the 3 sections within the new design standards to represent coal mining period of significance, early recreation period of significance, and then areas outside of each of those 2 periods of significance would be represented in the design standards relating to mass, scale, and form. And then as Mel mentioned, we're currently surveying buildings from that period of significance, the early recreation, right now to better understand what buildings will contribute to that period of significance. And we'll be doing more outreach and discussion with homeowners about that once we know more about what that list looks like.
So that was a lot, and I know we went a little over on time, but we want to make sure to leave time for your questions. So Miles is going to take over for a Q&A, but just know that you can find a fact sheet of all of the proposed changes and considerations on our website where you registered for this webinar. The recording will also be posted there too. And yeah, let's turn it over to your questions. Over to you, Miles.
Thanks, Mel. And we will be following up with information after this webinar. So you have a direct link to this survey that you see and direct links to the town website with those fact sheets and everything as well. And so I'm seeing one question popped into our Q&A feature. You can also find the raise hand button. And if you want to ask your question, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you. But let's start first with what we have in our Q&A function, and that is some properties in the T-zone have both residential and community components that already have an interior door connecting the spaces. With a mixed-use property, mortgage rates are much higher, commercial adjusting lended rates even if the property is two-thirds residential, which makes the property much less affordable. The question is, how can the town encourage private money to streamline the conversion of these commercial office spaces into residential studio condos or additional bedrooms in mixed-use properties to expand deed-restricted workforce housing within town limits while making these properties more affordable?
I think that is a really great question. And I think as we look to the combination of our code and our new housing strategy, is how would we think of maybe a program to help try to incentivize that and help get to the root of the challenges happening there? So I think what I would suggest is maybe if you'd be willing to reach out to us to meet with us to tell us more about the situation you're seeing. And as we start off this new housing strategy, that would be really helpful to better understand exactly what's going on so we could look to potentially looking at some sort of collaborative program.
Mel, can I hop into on what I think this person is referencing? We also Mel mentioned it earlier, but we did split the T zone into R4 and then also B2. So I think some of the mixed use buildings are actually going to be in the B2. I think most of the residential aren't mixed use that are converting over to the R4 zone, but I just wanted to clarify that in case that was confusing at all. So
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. It's a great clarification.
Awesome. Thank you, Mel and Jesse, and great question. I want to go now to the virtual hand that we have up from Councilman Kent Cowherd. And Kent, you should be able to unmute yourself.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
We can.
Great. Thanks. Some of my comments kind of refer to some of that last discussion around mixed use of people living and working. But it's not about converting spaces, it's more about allowing that use. So my comments mostly circle around the T zone. And what I'm kind of looking at is maybe it's better called the transition zone in my mind. And I got my normal kind of shotgun of ideas, shotgun of different uses that I think we might want to contemplate for this zone. I kind of see this zone, the T zone, as kind of like the junk drawer of the zones in town. And maybe it can kind of handle anything and everything that the other zones kind of can't quite support. And as an example of that, and also being kind of the most open or unlimited zone in a lot of ways, that would allow, free market development that's the most unrestricted there may be a spot that's needed for that in town. My first comment is, why not allow some different uses? Yeah, so some of my primary uses that I would like to see is and I've talked about this before, but live work units, mixed use live work units. Maybe this is actually the zone where they could allowed to be where this could live and this could be allowed, and then encourage and incentivize it by making it a permitted use. Live work units have a lot of extra benefits besides just residential units. So that would also speak to affordability and small businesses and locals. So live work units, I can't say enough about. Other uses that may be good might be considered is maybe some uses that could support other uses in town that don't have enough to support them. As an example, like what about long-term storage units that may be needed for, as an example, we're looking at doing small residential units and other and density increases, but these small residential units don't have enough storage for themselves, so they would need offsite storage, right? Why not allow that use in another zone that where the one zone could support another? They could complement. And I heard that word today, and I like it. Complement each other, support each other. Where one's inadequate, the other can help. So, and then I'm pretty creative, but what about allowing a single unit now if we're not allowing a single family? But what about my imagination goes wild? A single unit could be allowed, but with maybe a massive affordable housing fee to compensate for the loss of the potential that could go on there. And then, or maybe it could be allowed if the storage units are built below it. I could see a big ass private penthouse on the top floor and a bunch of storage units below. Storage units below supporting the town, private penthouse above for private penthouse guy. Let me see. I'm just kind of looking through my notes some more. Oh, here's a new permitted use. There's a national trend for shared living units as a way to make things more affordable. So elderly people can circle up with themselves and support each other and have shared living units. And I'm not sure if the zone speaks to that or not, but what about that as a permitted use? And then just a final comment, or maybe this could be a more open or free market zone in some ways that's the most unrestricted, so that there is a spot that lives for anything that could be the most flexible for any future unanticipated use or need. There's stuff that we can't think of right now, but maybe this zone speaks to that and says, hey, this zone's open for stuff that we don't even know about. I think that's all my scattering of notes. Thanks for you guys being patient with me.
Ken, thanks for that feedback. And there's a lot of energy, it seems like, on the T zone and that residential commercial interplay. And we had another comment come in as you were making yours about, the commercial lending aspects of, even if a unit is 2/3 residential, the commercial lending is more expensive. So finding that balance, it seems like there's a lot of energy on the potential for the T zone. And Mel, I don't know if you have additional comments before we move on to our next question.
Yeah, and Kent, thank you so much for all those ideas and comments. They're really great ideas. And again, we're just at the beginning of the process. But going back to Jesse's point, we're just trying to think through like the scale and size of the zone itself and recognizing how a lot of those mixed use ones would be parsed out into B2 along 6th Street of that more mixed use commercial focus zone with residential. We're recognizing, do we try to reserve the zone for high density residential of what it already is? But in the B2 workshop, we will be talking about live work units and those sorts of things. And then we did include congregate housing, shared housing as a potential in this zone. But I think the trade-offs of trying to keep this zone fully housing or more mixed use is definitely something to talk about through this process. So I really appreciate the feedback and creativity there.
Amen. Thank you, Ken. And Mel, we've got a great question coming in from Wayne asking, what restrictions would come into play if property is designated as historical in this new ski timeframe? Can we object to being designated historical?
I'm going to turn over to Jesse for this one.
Thank you. Wayne, I don't know, do you live at 218 Maroon? I'm just trying to remember in my head. In any case, we're doing survey work to help understand certain attributes of properties. So things like when was the property built? Does it have certain characteristics from a type of building from that era? For instance, the Queen of All Saints Church is a great example of a mid-century modern building within our town. And then our consultant has mentioned we have a lot of great examples of log buildings from the 1970s and 1980s. So those are kind of some examples from that building or from that time period. And then also Sylvanite is a really unique example of a building from that time period. But just to give you some perspective, we sent out 320 letters to property owners from uh, for property owners of buildings within that time period. We have a feeling it will be much, much less, as Mel said earlier on the map. She showed the map. We've tried to be really all inclusive of all the property owners from that time period to make sure then we can just narrow it down to what might be included. And so we did talk about originally the idea of a voluntary period of significance where people could opt in, but instead we decided to make it more of a mandatory, like our current period of significance is, where buildings are designated as historic by the town, and then we have the list of criteria backing us up as to why those are being designated as historic. Does that help to answer your question, Wayne?
And I think to add to that, just a big change in general is right now, no matter what period your building was built in, if you were to remodel it or change the outside of it, the current design standards would have it made to be look like it came from the mining era. So this instead would lead you to a new chapter of how do you make sure it maintains that look and feel of the era it originally came from.
Thank you, Jesse and Mel. And it does not look like we have any new questions or new hands raised. So maybe we can go to the next slide since we have 5 minutes left and just give a little run through of what's coming up with this process in terms of the webinars that we have scheduled for other zone districts. It'll also give everybody a chance to do one last call for comments before we sign off here today. But as we mentioned, we had the mobile home district kickoff webinar yesterday at 4 p.m. Today, we certainly have the higher density residential districts. Our next webinar after today is scheduled for November 6th at noon for the mixed use districts. Then on November 7th at 10 a.m., we've got the Business 1 district, which includes Elk Avenue. After that, November 11th at 4 p.m., the Business 2 district on 6th. November 12th at 4 p.m. is the Commercial district, the C zone on Bellevue. Then the final one scheduled is November 20th at noon for the residential districts. And all of those are available on the town's website as well. And again, we will be sending you all a link to all of this information after this meeting. And it looks like we've got Kent's hand up. Kent, you should be able to unmute.
Yeah, thank you. I did review my notes and I did have one last thing to point at for a potential use to consider. And I'm sure it's not that, well, I'll just go through it. But what I see as a potential need in town is for maybe short-term overnight RV parking or even just short-term private parking. So yeah, just wanted to put that out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Kent. Great comments. And Mel or Jesse, I don't know if any additional comments or anything else you want to share with the group in the last few minutes we have remaining.
I would just really emphasize we put a lot of information out there to you today. So we do have essentially a fact sheet, and I apologize, I meant to make this one on the side for this zone, but that got lost. But for the R4 zone or any of the other zones that you want to look at of this first draft of considerations, and then a big survey open where you can give as general or as specific feedback as you'd like. But this is complicated, it's complex. There's so many great ideas out there and so many topics. So please contact us if you want to meet with us. We can come to you, meet you in your neighborhood. We can meet over coffee, meet over the phone, and we'd love to better understand what you're seeing, what you're experiencing, and your questions on this. So please do not be afraid to contact us.
Thank you, Mel. We had one more comment come in from Candace. She says, well, many of these structures may be in that particular period, the ski and rec period, look cool. Many suffer from functional and economic obsolescence, particularly with very limited heating options since natural gas is no longer available. So good comment coming in there on the new period of significance, the survey work that's going, and the design standards that are upcoming.
Yeah, so as Jesse said, if your home or building is being surveyed, you have been received a letter, and then there was a meeting during the preservation plan too to talk about the concept. And after the results of that survey, there will be much more outreach with those property owners to come to talk about your feedback and thoughts on that designation. So thank you, Candace.
And Mel, with that, I don't see any other hands up or any new questions, and we are just about right at time. So I'll hand it back over to town staff to thank everybody and adjourn us today.
So thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with us. We hope we'll see you at some of the other webinars over the coming weeks. But again, we hope to hear from you as you engage in this process. So thank you again. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a happy Halloween tomorrow.
Thanks so much, everybody.